Why do avoidants stay exactly the same through relationship after relationship, year after year? Most people think it's because they don't want to change, that they're selfish, commitment phobic, or just don't care enough to grow. That if they really loved you, they'd naturally become more emotionally available. Wrong. The truth about why avoidants rarely change has nothing to do with love or caring. It has everything to do with a mental pattern that keeps them locked in the same behaviors. And, ironically, most people's attempts to help them change actually make this pattern stronger. But there's something specific you can do that disrupts their entire system, something that creates the exact conditions where change becomes not just possible, but almost inevitable for them. The problem is, it's the opposite of what every relationship expert tells you to do. Think about the last time someone tried to convince you to change something about yourself. Maybe a partner wanted you to be more social, or a friend suggested you should be less sensitive, or a family member thought you should handle stress differently. How did that feel? Even if they were right, even if the change would benefit you, something inside probably resisted. Not because you're stubborn, but because being told to change triggers a fundamental human defense mechanism. Now imagine that feeling, but multiplied by 10. That's what happens when you suggest change to an avoidant. Avoidants didn't just develop their attachment style randomly. They developed it as a survival strategy in environments where emotional expression was dangerous, inconsistent, or overwhelming. Their emotional walls aren't just preferences. They're protective systems that once saved them. So when someone suggests they should be more open, more emotionally available, more vulnerable, their entire nervous system interprets this as a threat. Not a logical threat, but a survival threat. Like asking someone with a broken leg to start running. The suggestion itself causes pain. There's another layer to this resistance that most people overlook completely. Committing to emotional growth in a relationship means accepting responsibility not just for your partner's emotions, but for all the social expectations that come with being in a defined, committed relationship. Think about what happens when someone introduces you as their girlfriend or boyfriend versus when they introduce you as someone I'm seeing, or just by your name. The label comes with assumptions about your role in their life, their obligations to you, and how others will judge their behavior toward you. Avoidants often prefer the comfort of undefined relationships because ambiguity protects them from accountability. If you're not officially together, they can't be criticized for not acting like a committed partner. If friends ask why they didn't invite you to something or why they seem distant, they can point to the lack of labels as justification. This ambiguity also protects them from having to explain their choices to family members, friends, or colleagues who might have opinions about how they should treat someone they care about. When the relationship exists in a gray area, so do the expectations and judgments from their social circle. This is why traditional approaches to encouraging avoidant change fail so spectacularly. Couples therapy focused on communication skills, heart-to-heart conversations about emotional needs, gentle encouragement to open up more. All of these approaches accidentally trigger the very walls they're trying to break down. Your well-meaning attempts to create change actually reinforce their belief that emotional intimacy is dangerous and should be avoided. But there's something more complex happening here that most people miss entirely. Avoidants have an internal emotional system that works like a pressure cooker. When emotional pressure builds up, through relationship conflicts, demands for intimacy, or discussions about feelings, they have two options: explode or release the pressure. Most avoidants choose to release pressure gradually. They create distance, become less available, or shut down emotionally until the pressure decreases to manageable levels. This pressure release prevents emotional explosions, but it also prevents change. Here's why. Real change requires sustained emotional discomfort. Not overwhelming pressure that triggers their defense mechanisms, but consistent, manageable discomfort that gradually expands their comfort zone. Think of it like building muscle strength. You need consistent progressive resistance over time to get stronger. Too much weight and you get injured. No resistance and nothing changes. But most people in relationships with avoidance accidentally provide the wrong kind of pressure at the wrong times. They create intense emotional conversations, followed by periods of backing off when the avoidant seems overwhelmed. This on and off pressure actually trains the avoidant that emotional intensity is temporary and can be waited out. The avoidant learns that if they just endure the uncomfortable conversation or give minimal responses, eventually the pressure will decrease and they can return to their comfort zone. They never have to actually change because the pressure never stays consistent long enough to make change necessary. It's like trying to reshape clay by pressing on it briefly, then stopping completely before applying pressure again. The clay never stays soft long enough to take a new form. This explains why avoidants can seem to make progress during intense relationship discussions, only to return to exactly the same patterns once things calm down. They weren't being manipulative. They were just responding to temporary pressure that they knew would eventually decrease. Now here's where it gets more interesting. Avoidants only change when they feel completely safe, but they can only feel completely safe when there's no pressure to change. This creates an impossible situation for most people trying to help avoidants grow, push for change, and you eliminate safety. Provide total safety and you eliminate the motivation to change. Most relationship advice fails because it doesn't account for this contradiction. Be patient and understanding eliminates pressure but also eliminates progress. Set firm boundaries and expectations creates pressure but destroys safety. But there's a third approach that most people never consider. What if you could create a situation where the avoidant feels completely safe while simultaneously making their current patterns unsustainable? Think about how people change jobs. Most don't quit because someone pressures them to find better work. They quit when their current situation becomes more uncomfortable than the uncertainty of change. The motivation comes from internal dissatisfaction, not external pressure. The same principle applies to avoidant attachment patterns. Avoidants change when their current emotional strategies stop working effectively, not when someone convinces them to try new strategies. This distinction is crucial. When you push someone to change, their walls go up automatically. But when they decide they want something different because their current approach isn't working anymore, those same walls don't activate. The change feels like their own idea instead of something being forced on them. So how do you make their current approach stop working without pushing them? You stop covering for their emotional unavailability and start giving them the same energy they give you. This isn't passive acceptance of bad behavior. It's active demonstration of what their emotional unavailability actually costs them, not through arguments or discussions, but through natural consequences. When an avoidant is emotionally distant, you match their distance without drama or explanation. When they're inconsistent with communication, you become equally inconsistent without making it a relationship issue. When they prioritize other things over the relationship, you do the same. This approach works because it removes the familiar dynamic where they're the emotionally unavailable one and you're the one seeking more connection. Instead, you both become equally available or unavailable, which creates a completely different psychological situation. Most avoidants are used to being in relationships where they control the emotional temperature. They decide how much intimacy happens when emotional conversations occur and what level of connection feels comfortable. This control helps them feel safe, but it also prevents them from experiencing what emotional distance actually feels like from the other side. When you reflect their patterns instead of compensating for them, you remove their control over the relationship's emotional climate. Suddenly they're experiencing emotional distance instead of creating it. They're on the receiving end of inconsistency instead of being the source of it. This reversal often triggers something unexpected in avoidance. They start wanting more connection, not because someone is pressuring them for it, but because they're experiencing what it feels like to not have it available. But there's a specific way this needs to be done, or it backfires completely. The key to effective reflection is emotional detachment from the outcome. You're not reflecting their behavior to make them change. You're reflecting it because you've decided that matching energy levels is healthier than constantly giving more than you receive. This distinction is crucial. If you're secretly hoping that becoming less available will make them more available, you're still operating from a place of trying to control their behavior. Avoidance can sense this manipulation, even when it's unconscious. True reflection comes from a genuine shift in your own priorities. You stop trying to maintain the relationship's emotional connection single-handedly. You stop being the one who always initiates deep conversations, plans quality time together, or works to resolve conflicts. Instead, you focus on your own life with the same energy you used to focus on the relationship. You become genuinely busy with your own interests, goals, and relationships. You respond to their energy level naturally, without strategy or calculation. This shift creates several changes that avoidants rarely experience. First, they lose their position as the relationship's emotional gatekeeper. They can no longer control how much intimacy happens by controlling their own availability. If they want connection, they have to actually initiate it rather than waiting for you to pursue them. Second, they experience what it feels like to be the one who wants more emotional connection than their partner is offering. This role reversal often triggers empathy they didn't know they had for your previous position in the relationship. Third, they discover that emotional distance feels different when they're not the one choosing it. Being on the receiving end of indifference often motivates them to create the very connection they previously avoided, but this approach requires real internal change, not just acting differently on the surface. You can't fake this kind of emotional shift. Avoidants are highly sensitive to when what people say doesn't match what they actually feel. If you're pretending to be less invested while secretly hoping they'll become more invested, they'll sense the manipulation and become even more guarded. The reflection approach only works when it comes from an authentic place of self-respect and personal boundaries. You have to genuinely decide that you're not willing to be the only person working to maintain emotional connection in the relationship. This decision often requires processing your own attachment patterns. Many people who are drawn to avoidance have anxious attachment styles that make them feel responsible for managing other people's emotions and maintaining relationship harmony. If you're naturally inclined to pursue when someone withdraws, to give more when someone gives less, or to work harder when someone works less, then stepping back from this pattern will feel uncomfortable at first. It might feel like you're being cold, uncaring, or giving up on the relationship. But here's what most people don't understand. Your overcompensating behavior actually enables the avoidant's emotional unavailability. When you consistently provide more energy, emotion, and effort than they do, you remove their motivation to increase their own investment. It's like doing someone's homework for them every night. You're helping them avoid the consequences of not doing the work, but you're also preventing them from developing the skills and discipline they need to succeed on their own. When you stop overcompensating, you're not punishing the avoidant or withdrawing love. You're creating space for them to step up and contribute to the relationship's emotional maintenance. You're giving them the opportunity to discover what it feels like to be the one who initiates, who pursues, who works to maintain connection. Many avoidants have never experienced this role reversal because their partners typically compensate for their emotional unavailability automatically. They've never had to develop the skills of emotional pursuit because someone else always handled that aspect of the relationship. But when you stop handling it for them, they're forced to either develop those skills or accept a relationship with minimal emotional connection. Most avoidants, when actually faced with this choice, choose to develop the skills rather than accept the emotional distance. The key is understanding that this process takes time and requires consistency on your part. Avoidants will initially test whether your change in behavior is permanent or temporary. They might become even more distant at first, expecting you to return to your previous pattern of pursuing them. If you go back to overcompensating during this testing phase, you'll confirm their belief that your boundaries are temporary and that they can wait out your new approach. But if you maintain your new energy-matching behavior consistently, they'll eventually realize that the relationship dynamic has permanently shifted. This realization often triggers a period of internal conflict for the avoidant. Part of them feels relieved that the pressure to be more emotionally available has decreased. But another part starts to miss the emotional safety net your previous behavior provided. They begin to notice that they're no longer the center of your emotional focus. They see that you have other interests, other relationships, other priorities that don't revolve around them. They experience what it feels like to be in a relationship where they're not automatically the most important thing in your life. For many avoidants, this experience triggers unexpected feelings of insecurity and a desire for more connection. Not because you're pressuring them for it, but because they're discovering that they actually value the emotional connection more than they realized when it was always guaranteed. This internal motivation is completely different from external pressure to change. When the desire for more connection comes from their own experience of missing it, they don't interpret it as a threat to their emotional safety. Instead, they see it as their own choice to pursue something they've discovered they want. But there's another element that makes this approach particularly effective with avoidance. When you stop trying to manage their emotions and reactions, you force them to take responsibility for their own emotional experience in the relationship. Previously, when you pursued them after they withdrew, you were essentially taking responsibility for repairing the emotional disconnection they created. When you initiated conversations about relationship issues, you were taking responsibility for addressing problems that affected both of you. But when you step back from these caretaking roles, the avoidant has to either take responsibility for maintaining the relationship's emotional health or accept that the relationship will deteriorate from neglect. Most avoidants, when faced with this choice, realize they don't actually want the relationship to deteriorate. They discover that they care more about maintaining the connection than they realized when someone else was always working to preserve it. There's something particularly revealing about watching an avoidant navigate this new dynamic. You'll notice them becoming more attentive to your moods and availability. They start paying closer attention to when you're distant versus when you're engaged. They begin initiating conversations and making plans instead of waiting for you to do the emotional labor. It's like watching someone learn to cook for the first time after years of having meals prepared for them. At first, they're clumsy and uncertain. They might order takeout for a few days, hoping you'll go back to cooking, but eventually hunger motivates them to figure it out. The hunger, in this case, is their need for emotional connection that they didn't realize they had when it was always being provided by someone else. But here's what makes this approach particularly effective. It forces the avoidant to confront what they actually bring to the relationship. When you're no longer overcompensating for their emotional unavailability, both of you get a clearer picture of their natural contribution level. Some avoidants discover that they're actually capable of much more emotional investment than they previously demonstrated. Others realize that they genuinely prefer minimal emotional involvement and make peace with that reality. Both discoveries are valuable. The ones who discover hidden capacity often surprise themselves. They might find that they enjoy planning romantic gestures when they're not feeling pressured to do so. They might realize that they like deeper conversations when those conversations aren't being forced on them during times when they feel emotionally maxed out. The ones who genuinely prefer minimal involvement at least become honest about it. Instead of stringing along someone who wants more connection, they either accept that their relationship capacity is limited or they let the person go to find someone who can match their energy. This honesty, while potentially painful, is far more respectful than allowing someone to exhaust themselves trying to create a dynamic that the avoidant has no intention of reciprocating. There's also something important that happens to you during this process. When you stop focusing all your energy on managing someone else's emotional availability, you rediscover parts of yourself that may have gotten lost in the relationship. You remember what it's like to have your own interests that don't revolve around someone else's mood or availability. You reconnect with friends you may have neglected while trying to create intimacy with someone who wasn't reciprocating. You start pursuing goals and activities that fulfill you independently. This personal renaissance often makes you more attractive, not just to the avoidant, but to people in general. There's something magnetic about someone who has a full, interesting life that doesn't depend on any one person's attention or approval. Many people discover that when they stop chasing an avoidance validation, they start attracting more attention from people who are naturally more emotionally available. This expanded dating pool gives them perspective on what healthy emotional reciprocity actually looks like. Sometimes this perspective leads them to realize that what they thought was love with the avoidant was actually just getting hooked on unpredictable attention. The random moments of connection felt intense because they were rare, not because they were particularly special. When you experience consistent emotional availability from someone new, the avoidance breadcrumbs start to look like exactly what they were: insufficient nourishment for a healthy relationship. There's another layer to why avoidants resist change that most people overlook completely. Committing to growth in a relationship means accepting responsibility not just for your partner's emotions, but for all the social expectations that come with being in a defined relationship. Think about what happens when someone introduces you as their girlfriend or boyfriend versus when they introduce you as someone I'm seeing or just by your name. The label comes with assumptions about your role in their life, their obligations to you, and how others will judge their behavior toward you. Avoidants often prefer the comfort of undefined relationships because ambiguity protects them from accountability. If you're not officially together, they can't be criticized for not acting like a committed partner. If friends ask why they didn't invite you to something or why they seem distant, they can point to the lack of labels as justification. This ambiguity also protects them from having to explain their choices to family members, friends, or colleagues who might have opinions about how they should treat someone they care about. When the relationship exists in a gray area, so do the expectations and judgments from their social circle. But when you stop accepting undefined dynamics and start requiring the same level of investment you're providing, you force them to choose between stepping up or losing access to you. This choice eliminates their comfortable middle ground of having connection without responsibility. The process isn't always smooth or linear. Avoidants might go through periods of increased distance before they start moving toward more connection. They might test your boundaries multiple times to see if your new approach is genuine or strategic. But if you maintain your energy-matching behavior consistently, without expectation or manipulation, most avoidants will eventually begin to increase their own emotional investment in the relationship. Not because they're being pressured to, but because they've discovered through their own experience that they want more connection than their current patterns provide. The beautiful thing about this approach is that it works whether they change or not. If they step up and start investing more emotionally, you get the relationship you wanted. If they don't, you get clarity about what they're actually willing to offer and can make informed decisions about your future. Either way, you stop wasting energy on someone who isn't matching your investment. You stop being the relationship's emotional caretaker. You stop accepting breadcrumbs while hoping they'll eventually offer you a full meal. Most people spend months or years trying to convince avoidants to change through conversation, patience, or perfect behavior. But avoidants don't change because someone explains why they should. They change when their current approach stops working for them. When you stop making their emotional unavailability comfortable and consequence-free, you force them to decide what they actually want. Some will choose to invest more. Others will choose to stay distant and eventually lose access to you entirely. Both outcomes serve you better than endlessly trying to love someone into changing while they remain comfortable with the status quo. Have you tried energy matching with an avoidant partner, or have you been stuck in the overcompensating cycle? Drop a comment about your experience with stepping back from managing someone else's emotional availability. If this helped you understand why traditional approaches to encouraging avoidant change usually fail, like this video and subscribe for more insights about attachment patterns and relationship dynamics that actually work. Thanks for watching.